Right. Good morning, everyone. The time is now 10:30, and we're supposed to start at this point, but I still see that people are joining. At the moment, we've got about 204 people online. And after over 700 registrations, I think we're probably going to get a couple more people joining. So if you can just bear with us just maybe for another minute, and we'll get started thereafter. But welcome and good morning, everyone. I'll be back in a minute. Thanks. Okay, I think we can get started. Once again, good morning, Sanibonani, Goeiemorgen, Molweni, Dumelang, Absheni, and all the other official languages. My name is Mangamu Tukulula. I am a human factors and ergonomics specialist at Smart Ergonomics. I'm also the managing director and founder of Smart Ergonomics. Today, we are going to be doing this webinar titled Ergonomic Risks Associated with Shifts and Roster Schedules. And before I get started with the presentation, so just to make sure that you're in the right webinar, that's what we're talking about today. But before I get started, I would just like to highlight the fact that we've got the chat function. I think it's on the right of your screen. And please, can you use that to greet, tell us where you're joining us from. I can see there's people literally from around the country. I can also see that there's a couple of people who joined us in our last webinar on musculoskeletal disorders. So thank you for joining us for this webinar as well. Please also use the chat function to make any comments regarding what is being discussed during the webinar, and also to ask questions. We do have a session right at the end after all the presentations where we will be giving you an opportunity to ask us any questions. So you may start asking those questions as we go along. But without any further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can get started. Okay, so as I've indicated, my name is Mangamu Tukulula, and I'm a human factors and ergonomics specialist at Smart Ergonomics, and I'm one of the two presenters for this webinar. So I'm not on my own today. I've got a colleague, friend, ex ex-schoolmate, and a whole lot of other things, who's going to be joining me today, Dr. Jonathan Davey, but I will introduce him a little bit later. But just to get started, so this webinar, we are basically going to be talking about the ergonomic risks associated with shift and roster schedules. And the reason why we are doing a webinar on this is because there have been a lot of questions that have been asked of me as I go about doing my normal work, which is providing ergonomic services to various clients in a lot of different industries, but also seeing some of the gaps in terms of the management of shifts and rosters in practice. So some of the questions that have been coming up, which were basically the primer for us organizing this webinar, people are asking, in order to ensure that work is productive while also still ensuring that it's safe, how should work be scheduled? And some of the questions that come from there are, how long should people work? How long and frequently should breaks be provided? When are the best and the worst times to schedule work? And what factors should be considered when designing and managing shifts and roster schedules? And also, what can be done to preserve efficiency and safety when work is scheduled at suboptimal times? Because in a lot of cases, you find that the conditions are not necessarily the best, but you still have to continue with work. So under those circumstances, how do you still ensure that efficiency is maintained and that safety is not compromised? And then also, should shifts and rosters be adjusted when fewer personnel are available? So especially with COVID-19, where some people are, being retrenched. There are deaths within workplaces. There are also retrenchments that are happening. So there's a lot of changes that are happening. So now the question is, does this, or should it, have an impact? And should we be adjusting shifts and rosters now that you're possibly having these changes in personnel? And some of these questions are not quick yes or no answers. And so the idea behind this webinar is to sensitize everyone to some of the ergonomic risks that are associated with shifts and roster schedules, because ultimately, since this is still Ergonomics Month, we are trying to spread awareness about the discipline, but in particular, as Smart Ergonomics, we are trying to ensure that we provide information on some of the questions, the burning questions that people are having in industry. And so in this webinar, some of the discussion points and insights will include a very brief introduction or overview of some of the work scheduling changes, looking at the past, current, as well as in the future. We're then going to very briefly look at the legal requirements for the management of working time and breaks in organizations. And then we're going to contrast that to some of the requirements in terms of managing ergonomic risks, because I think there's usually, a common practice where scheduling of work is mainly going to be based on what the legal requirements are. And now we need to maybe look and see if that is still compatible with the management of ergonomic risk. So we're going to very briefly look at some of the legal requirements there. And then we're going to use a case study. And this is where Dr. Davy is going to come in. And he's going to take us through some of the ergonomic considerations, giving us some of the scientific understanding and theory regarding some of the risks that are prevalent when shifts and different work schedules are implemented. And the idea here will be through using the case study, and it's a hypothetical case study based on some of the stuff that we have seen in industry. He's going to show us where are some of these risks that you need to be aware of. And I hope that you can then apply what he's going to be doing with the case study to your specific context. We're then going to take it back, and I'm going to take you through some of the practical implications for managing ergonomic risks when designing and managing shifts and rosters. And here, we're going to touch on what do you need to think about during recruitment? What do you need to think about for medical surveillance? What is the impact of some of the decisions that are made when you are, when different industries are coming up with variation agreements in terms of how work should be scheduled? The issue of standby shifts and workload planning and management, and even fatigue risk management systems. And then we're also going to touch on occurrences and a little bit on the implications for auditing. But before we get into that, and before I hand over to Dr. Davy, I just want us to take a step back and look at why, firstly, should we be concerned about work schedules, shifts, and rosters? And if we take a global view, you see on this graph here, which is provided, we've taken a couple of different countries, and we're trying to see over time, so over the years, how have the number of hours worked by workers on an annual basis, how have those changed? And I'll just pinpoint two, in particular South Africa. You can see that there's a general trend where we are going down in terms of the annual number of hours worked per worker over time. However, we are still one of the countries with the highest number of hours worked annually by workers. And of course, this includes industries which are working, just normal daytime working, as well as those who are working 24-hour operations. And what's alarming is that everyone is always going on about how China just works their people to the bones. But if we look at the number of hours that South Africa is working, we're even higher than China. And then, as I indicated a little bit earlier, the trend has been that generally workers are working less hours annually over time in South Africa. However, while the overall number of hours worked has decreased over time in South Africa, there's also reason to believe that the already high working hours will likely increase in the next based on COVID in the last 2 years. We still haven't got the data for that, but we know that there are some instances where the number of hours that are worked by certain industries have reduced because of retrenchments. However, for some industries, the number of hours that are actually being worked is increasing, and that's because there are changes in the way that work is being done. But there's also evidence that these suboptimal work schedules and shifts and rosters are actually detrimental on worker health and the safety of operations. And so we should be concerned about this, especially because we are working much more than what other countries are doing at the moment. And I think also there are a lot of misconceptions that are currently in play in different industries where, for example, the general belief is that if you want to be more productive, you must make people work more hours. But if we look at the statistics, we can see that the more developed nations are actually working less hours, yet they are more productive per hour worked. Whereas with the countries like ours, like South Africa and China, we work more hours, but we're actually not as productive then. So our input in terms of working time versus what we get out of it is actually, not really compatible. And so I think it's important to look at currently, based on some of the general trends that we have seen, what are the common approaches that are currently being used in different organizations in terms of setting the schedules, deciding how long people should work, deciding how shift work should be organized. And generally, you'll find that what is really prioritized or is a priority are operational requirements. So you'll find that targets will be set based on this is how much product we need to move. This is how much we need to manufacture. And then there will also then come in, the other aspect that will come in will be industry norms and standards, where we say within the mining industry, this is how we have done things in the past. Within the, maybe railway industry, this is how we normally do work. And so that then comes in as well. And then in addition to that, legal and regulatory requirements also come in. And in particular, it's the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which predominates in the decisions that are made regarding work schedules. So they'll take operational requirements, industry norms, put them together, and then just make sure that the legal requirements are still met in terms of the minimum and maximum hours and work and rest schedules. And so the question is that actually working? What we are seeing is that generally the trend is that people are just made to work until they get to a breaking point where they either get injured, where they start making errors, where they start getting involved in incidents, or even they start getting sick, as opposed to taking a more staggered approach where you realize that in order to sustain performance at optimal levels, you need to be providing rest at more regular intervals. And then also, I think the other general trend that we are seeing is instead of taking a break before we reach exhaustion levels or before people start breaking down and having all these negative effects on performance and safety and even health, instead we are only, the general trend with the working schedules is that people have to work, and then when they're exhausted, we start providing some kind of reprieve or rest. And obviously, this is not really the optimal way of doing it, as we will discuss in a few minutes' time. And I think when we look at the legal and regulatory requirements that so heavily influence the decisions about what should actually be working, how things should actually be working, you'll see that generally, when these decisions are being made, especially when they are mostly influenced by the legal and regulatory requirements, we are actually not taking cognizance of the complexity within which these work schedules and shifts are actually going to be existing. And so I think part of the reason behind this webinar is to say, let's move away from this simplistic way of designing and managing work schedules and shifts, and let us show you just how complex this thing is and what you also need to consider as you are designing and managing these different shifts and work schedules. And I think when we get to the case study, you will see just how many other factors actually should be considered because of the impact that they will have in terms of the ergonomic risks that will manifest if they're not considered. And so the question that we will, that I think everyone needs to ask themselves is, the current approaches that you are adopting within your organizations, do they actually address and manage ergonomic risks adequately within your work schedules? And before we can answer that question, I think it's important because there's a lot of people who are not necessarily from the discipline of ergonomics and human factors. Let's just for maybe 2 minutes get into what is this ergonomics and what is this human factors and what are therefore some of the ergonomic risks that we are trying to deal with in this webinar. So if we look at the definition provided by the International Ergonomics Association, ergonomics, which is synonymous with human factors, is a scientific discipline that is concerned with understanding interactions amongst humans. So if we look at work systems, humans are at the core of these work systems, and we're trying to understand how these humans are interacting with the technologies and tools, with the tasks that they're performing, with the environments that they're working in, and the organizations that they are also functioning within. And so the idea is that these interactions are complex. They're not really simple or linear. And through these interactions, that's where performance, if there's a mismatch essentially between what the human's capabilities and limitations and needs are, if there's a mismatch with that and all the other elements in the system, then we're going to find the suboptimal performance of the system and of the actual individuals themselves. And so within the discipline of ergonomics, what we're trying to do is through design, so through deliberately putting in specific elements and designing them around the capabilities and limitations of people, we then can find a way of optimizing performance across the entire system. And for us to do that, we must realize that humans are complex in and of themselves. And to be able to design work systems, to design work shifts, to design rosters, we need to understand that these humans have various capabilities and limitations, and these manifest or exist within the physical interactions, within the cognitive and psychological spaces, as well as social and psychosocial, and as well as even the organizational factors will come in there. And so when we are trying to optimize performance, through the design, in this particular case or example, through the design of work systems and the work shifts and schedules, we need to understand what are the humans capable of, what are their limitations, and then everything needs to be designed around that. Because if we fail to do that, we're going to obviously bring in some of these ergonomic risks into our system, which will also then lead to these undesirable outcomes from the system. And if I like to use this analogy, so what do we mean about making sure that there's a fit between the human's capabilities and limitations as well as system elements? If we use the analogy of this, we'll call this the system as an analogy. And in the blue discs, the blue round blocks are basically designed in a way that they are compatible with this wooden block. And in instances where you are not designing for the human or designing with the human in mind, you are definitely going to find that there is not going to be a match. And because you are not designing for these humans, what happens is that within these organizations, we take the proverbial hammer and we force fit these humans into the system that is not designed considering their needs, their limitations. And the impact of that is that because humans are adaptable, they will find a way of fitting around these systems that are not designed optimally. But ultimately, there is a cost to that. And that cost is basically depicted with these shavings on the ground, where basically, because you are force-fitting them into a work environment that is not suitable, they're going to start having errors. You're going to have reduced efficiency. There's going to be accidents, injuries, and even non-compliance to some of the legal and regulatory requirements. And so what we're trying to do within this work system is, or rather within the discipline, is to try and find ways of designing our systems, designing our shifts, designing our rosters in such a way that they consider what humans are capable of. They consider what the limitations are. And because humans are different, you are going to find that you're going to need to have some flexibility so that you can accommodate the variability of humans. And so when it comes to the issue of designing shifts, designing rosters, the suboptimal rosters and shifts will definitely have implications in terms of the ergonomic risks that will result. And this is mainly due to the mismatch between what workers are capable of and limitations in terms of how we are made up, as well as what you are demanding of them. So please keep this in mind, because as Dr. Davey is going through his presentation, remember that when we are designing and not considering the human, those are opportunities for these ergonomic risks to start manifesting. And then just very quickly, we're going to go through some of the work scheduling guidelines that are currently available, and there are quite a few of them. Obviously, the OSH Act is talking about, managing occupational risk exposures. And in that, anything that you do, including scheduling of work, you need to ensure that it's still safe and healthy for people to perform. And obviously, the Mine Health and Safety Act, similar kinds of principles are stipulated in there. But what we're going to focus on today is the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, because that's where most organizations are drawing from when it comes to how they are designing their shifts and schedules. And obviously, we're going to take that in the context of some of the other regulations that are prevalent in terms of the management of ergonomic risks, which would include ergonomics regulations, construction regulations, and even the OSH Act itself, because ergonomic risks are one of the occupational risk exposures. So if we look specifically now at the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, sorry, I wanted to start with the one on the left. The purpose behind it is obviously to regulate fair labor practices, to establish and enforce basic conditions of employment, and to regulate variations in basic conditions of employment. Nothing there talks about, explicitly anyway, about managing ergonomic risks. Nothing there specifically talks to managing fatigue risks. All right, just keep that in mind. And of course, you can't read the Basic Conditions of Employment Act alone. Keep in mind the OSH Act, keep in mind the ergonomics regulations and other regulations as well. It then specifies that for ordinary hours of work, you can have a maximum of 45 hours a week, 9 hours a day if you work less than 5 days a week, or 8 hours a day if you work more than 5 days a week. And obviously, these are mainly excluding senior managers, sales personnel that travel, and any work that needs to be done that could not have been anticipated. So keep these hours in mind as we talk about in the next slide, the next few slides, what happens to performance, what happens to productivity, what happens to injury risk. And then this also provide for, make provision for overtime, where no more than 3 hours overtime per day must be permitted, and no more than 10 hours overtime per week. They then also in the BCEA indicate that for every continuous 5 hours that is worked, at least 1 hour of a meal break needs to be provided. And in this hour, it says that employees can be asked or permitted to continue working if their work cannot be left unattended. And that for me is already a red flag. The next thing is that they say an agreement can be made in writing, which can allow you to reduce the meal intervals to no less than 30 minutes. So keep that in mind as well. And especially, you can even dispense with the interval if employees have to work up to 6 hours, less than 6 hours a day. So keep that in mind as well. And then it also speaks to the daily and weekly rest provisions, and basically daily rest periods of at least 12 hours, consecutive hours between shifts. And then also weekly rest period of at least 36 consecutive hours. And then daily rest periods may, by written agreement, be reduced to 10 hours for an employee who lives on the premises, and for those whose meal intervals last for at least 3 hours. And there are some variation agreements that exist in some industries which actually take this even lower for people who don't even live on premises, and they still have only 10 hours between shifts. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the implications. And then this speaks about employees' weekly rest periods can also be reduced up to 8 hours in a week if the rest period is provided the following week. So in other words, you are the BCEA is allowing you to accumulate working hours if you can provide rest or recovery in the following week. And of course, even for that, there's implications for cumulative fatigue, which I think Jonah will speak to as well. So keep this in mind, and let's look at some of the research in terms of what happens when people are working these long hours. So in this study, they compared 4 different studies, and in the first dotted line, they are making a comparison. If you are making people work 40 hours a week, I mean, if you're making the machine work 40 hours, you will get 40 hours worth of work. So 55 hours of productive work that you put in, you will get that out with the machine because it's constant. And that's, of course, given if the machine doesn't break down and all of that. But with people, it doesn't work like that. Increasing the amount of time that people work does not necessarily correspond to an increase in productivity, in productive hours. So if you look at study C, so this is in the gray, and D, which is in the dark blue, these workers, basically their performance or productivity of output was after a week of long hours without sufficient breaks. And you can see, in contrast to the machine, which just goes straight up in a linear fashion, you start getting a reduction over time in the hours that people are being productive. And that's after a week of long hours of not working. So yes, you can take it further, but of course, you start getting variations in performance and even a reduction in performance. And with study B, this was after people were working continuously for 4 weeks, long hours for 4 weeks. You can see that the longer people are working without sufficient breaks, the less you are able to get out of them, essentially. And then with study A, which is with this dark navy line here, productive hours per person, where they were already excessively fatigued through overwork. So that's not giving them sufficient rest over time. And you can see that there's a drastic reduction in productive hours that they are able to produce. And so I think the misconception that we're trying to get around here is productivity hours of humans rarely exceed 50 hours, even when the actual hours are far greater. So working under suboptimal conditions will lead to a reduction in productive time. So if organizations are asking people to keep working more and more, that is already going to have implications in terms of how productive those people are going to be. And on average, there's a 10% reduction, increase rather, a 10% increase in overtime will result in a 2.4% decrease in productivity. So please just keep that in mind. And then if we were to look at what the BCEA allows, because there's an over-reliance, or even I think sometimes the BCEA is used as an excuse to make people work for under some of these suboptimal conditions. If we look at what where this would put people in terms of what these studies have found, particularly if you look at overtime, if you've got people that are working overtime, which would be no more than 10 hours in addition to the normal work week, you can see if these people were already, for example, excessively fatigued, you are not going to get much out of them. In fact, you are probably putting them at greater risk of injury, and your productivity is definitely going to reduce. So sometimes following the maximum or the limits that are provided in the legal requirements is not necessarily going to be protecting you or your workers or the organization from some of these ergonomic risks which are coming from suboptimal shift and roster schedules. And then if we look at night work, we're not going to get into the details of this, but I just wanted to highlight 2 things. These are the main provisions that are provided for night work. So that's for people that are working shifts, people that are working rosters. It basically is saying that you need to inform workers about the risks that they're going to be exposed to. They have a right to undergo medical examination. And if something happens and their health is impacted, then they can be moved. There's not much that is provided in terms of guidance around how should you design shifts and rosters most optimally when you've got shift work happening or night work happening. And so please pay attention to some of the principles that Dr. Davey is going to be taking us through a little bit later. But what we know when it comes to shift work is that some of the evidence that was based on some of the Canadian research that was done is that the risk for injury is going to be higher for people that are working night shifts and rotating shifts compared to those who are working day shifts. So that the research suggests that. That means that when you are already designing your shifts, you need to be aware that there's a higher risk for those people. And then they also found in this research that night shift workers ended up taking more days off work per injury that was claimed for compared to those who are doing day shifts. So that suggests that maybe the injuries or the claims are due to more adverse effects or health effects, and therefore you definitely need to be doing something a little bit more to protect those workers. And also, night shift workers were also found that they were at higher risk of getting involved in fatal accidents. And therefore, this increased risk was attributed more to sleep-related deficiencies. And so what's important here is to understand that, it's really important to understand how do we best design these shifts so that they can mitigate some of these negative effects that are reported in some of the research. And what was interesting is that while men and women are both impacted by this, and in terms of the night shift and rotating shifts leading to twice the number of injuries compared to day shifts, women are still at a higher risk of injuries than the males are. So that means that your risk management needs to consider the fact that females are possibly at a higher risk of working these shifts. And so before I end my session, it's just to reiterate the idea behind this webinar is to sensitize our audience to the fact that there are a lot of other factors to consider when we are designing and managing shifts and roster schedules. And therefore, the idea behind the case study that we're going to be presenting is to show you just what some of these scenarios are, how they're contributing to some of these ergonomic risks. And so this scenario might be generic. However, I think each of you will probably find that there's some aspects which are similar for your context. But ultimately, please keep in mind that the risk factors that you need to consider will apply across different industries, across different scenarios. So the case study that we're going to be looking at today is based on Mr. X. Mr. X is a 55-year-old male. He's a married father of 3 children, and they range from newborn to 10 years old. And that's important. He is obese, and he suffers from different chronic diseases of lifestyle, including hypertension. He also suffers from low back pain and takes over-the-counter pain medication to try and manage this pain, although at times this makes him drowsy. He lives in an informal settlement around Pretoria, and his house is located next to a shebeen, which operates daily from the 10 o'clock in the morning until the early hours of the morning. He's also involved in his community activities, including community policing forum and patrols and all of that. So he's got a life outside of the work situation. In terms of his work details, still continuing with the case study, he works in a safety critical environment. And so whether it's whatever industry it is, his performance needs to always be optimal, because if not, there could be some safety implications. And most of what he is doing is predominantly cognitively demanding. And he has been in this job for the last year. He commutes to and from work. So to go to work, it takes him about an hour. And to get back from work, it takes him about another hour. So it's a 2-hour return trip. He also makes use of public transport when his car breaks down, and obviously it's overcrowded. He often comes to work already feeling tired, but he is afraid to say anything to his supervisor in case he will get punished for that. And then the last bits of the case study that you must please take note of: the organization that he works for has workers that do mostly predominantly cognitively demanding work. And then there are also others who do predominantly physically demanding work. So you've got the full spectrum in terms of the type of work that is being done in that organization. And they all work according to the same shifts and rosters. And sometimes, because they have staff shortages, they sometimes work outside of the roster to try and fill in some of the gaps that they might have. Mr. X is scheduled to work 5 consecutive day shifts per cycle. And then he rotates that with night shifts. And basically the shifts are 12 hours long, and he works from 6 to 6 in the morning to evening, or for the night shifts from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. And sometimes his supervisor requests his team to work more than 12 hours when there's a shortage of personnel. And this happens at least once in every shift cycle. So that would be almost every week he's working for longer than the 12 hours. And sometimes this normally comes to 15 hours per shift, but he has at times been working at least 18-hour shifts in a row. And where there's a shortage, sometimes workers are asked to come to report for duty at very short notice. And this normally when they are at rest. So when they're supposed to be away resting, they sometimes are asked to come to work. And workers are meant to take 1 hour break every 5 hours of continuous work. And they are actually allowed the flexibility to take their breaks whenever they need to. However, they cannot leave their workstations because they need to continue monitoring what's happening in their work environment. The only time they can take a break away from their workstation is when they have to go for a bathroom break. And so that's the scenario that we're going to be looking at. And some of the factors that Dr. Davey is going to take us through include shift work, the different types of shift work that are possible, whether it's rotating or cycling between day and night and the different variations there. He's going to take us through transitioning between day and night shifts. He's going to talk about early morning shifts and the impact of that, time between shifts in relation to recovery times. He's going to touch on some of the task factors, individual factors, impact of psychosocial factors, and even health in terms of medical health, physical health, and even psychological health, and a little bit more. So as he's going through the case studies, please can you keep paying attention to the fact that, yes, the case study is quite unique to this, but it is actually the factors that we're going to be discussing are relevant for a whole host of other scenarios. And so I would like to now invite Dr. Davey to please start sharing his camera, turn his camera on and start sharing his slides, and I'm going to introduce him. And so as he starts to do that, please turn your, there we go, there he is. Hi, Jono. So Dr. Jonathan Davey is currently a lecturer in the Department of Human Kinetics and Ergonomics at Rhodes University, having completed his undergraduate degrees at Rhodes, where he majored in human kinetics and ergonomics and organizational psychology. He went on to complete his honors, masters, as well as doctoral degrees in human kinetics and ergonomics. His research interests focus predominantly on understanding sleep-wake behavior and the effects of sleep loss and fatigue on human performance in different settings, including aviation, school-going adolescents, students, health workers, and more recently, academics. Nationally, he's currently the president of the Ergonomic Society of South Africa and the editor of the Society's journal, the Ergonomics South Africa. He has just taken over as the chair of communications and public relations for the International Ergonomics Association. So Jono is basically quite active locally as well as more recently internationally. But I think for me, the reason why I approached Jonathan to come here is because to participate in this webinar is because he really, for his PhD and research thereafter, has done a lot of work around understanding shifts and rosters and some of the ergonomic risks that are, prevalent around the design of shifts and rosters. So he's really qualified, really experienced, and just a wealth of knowledge that he's so willingly going to be sharing with us here. And so before he starts, and I know I'll say this again at the end, just want to once again just say thank you, Jono, for agreeing to participate in this initiative during Ergonomics Month, because I know you're also passionate about raising awareness regarding various ergonomics topics. So thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Smile, and a very good morning to all of you. Thank you for your very kind words, Smile. It's an absolute privilege to be here. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of, I guess, what I've learned over the years of studying shift work and fatigue and the effects of, I guess, rosters on sleep-wake behavior. But I must qualify something that I learn more from interacting with those who are on the ground trying to manage these challenges than reading through the literature. So really looking forward to the discussions that ensue after the presentation. So today I will just be speaking a little bit about some of these issues that we face when we talk about ergonomic risks associated with shift and roster designs. Smile has already taken us through the scenario that I'll be using as an example to kind of unpack some of the complexity around fatigue risk management, around managing the challenges related to shift work and working time. I'll sort of break this quite complex situation down for the audience as we go through. But I think what's important to state from the outset is that there is no universally accepted or optimal shift system design. And that is because we need to think about work systems as complex ecologies of interdependent factors. There is so much at play. There are so many interactions that happen within workspaces, working time arrangements being one of them. And so Dawson and Ferguson argue that it's perhaps more appropriate to conceptualize working time arrangements, shift work arrangements, as ecosystems and address the risks of overall systems as opposed to a single dimension of working time, such as how long a shift is, the time at which it starts and ends, etc. And so I'd like to just go into this discussion with that particular frame in mind, because it hopefully will underpin some of what I'm going to speak about today. And really what it comes down to, and Smiles alluded to this already, is that working time, and particularly working time that takes us out of our normal diurnal rhythms. We are diurnal, so we like to be awake during the day and sleep at night. Many of the shift working arrangements that we now work globally and in South Africa take us out of that and force us to be awake at times of the day when we shouldn't be, and trying to sleep at times of the day when we shouldn't be. And so really what it comes down to when we talk about ergonomics is we need to focus on the human, and we need to focus on what about the system creates this incompatibility, and shift work, night shift work, early morning work, extended work hours create some degree of incompatibility between humans and when and how they sleep and the quality of sleep that they get. And so these two seminal papers for me really underpin how we should focus at the first instance how to manage fatigue, and that is, or the effects of shift work, and that is through managing sleep. And so allow me to just give a little bit of a context around the importance of sleep and how it's controlled, because it's relevant to understand the impacts of different shifts on human sleep-wake behavior. So Koskinen and Dement argue that, say that sleep is a reversible behavioral state of perpetual disengagement from and unresponsiveness to the environment. And it's critical, not necessarily because we turn off, but because it's an opportunity for our bodies to recover. There are distinct stages that we cycle through each night. Non-rapid eye movement sleep is what we enter sleep into. There are 3 stages of non-REM sleep. And then we cycle into REM sleep, which is typically where we engage in dreaming. And we tend to go through those cycles about 3 or 4 times, sometimes 5 times a night. And sleep gets shallower as we arrive at the point we're about to wake up. It's very deep just after we've gone to sleep. And so it's really important that we get that good quality sleep. And the reason for that is that sleep has a recuperative role to play in our health and our wellness. So it recuperates the central nervous system, our brains, our nervous system, and generally the body systems. It clears metabolites and waste products from around the body. It supports immune system's function. If you think about what happens when you get sick, you want to sleep. And that's because of the importance that sleep has in immune system functions. It cools the brain to limit wear and tear. It provides an opportunity for synaptic homeostasis. So all little brain neurons are allowed to sort of down-regulate and are not firing all the time. And so we allow for balance. And it's also protective, because we don't want to walk around or drive around or operate heavy equipment when we are sleepy. And so sleep offers us an important avenue to go to sleep and to be protected from doing things that are not safe. But it's also important from an adaptive perspective, in the sense that it's critical for learning. If we don't get sleep, we are not processing the information that we have interacted with during the course of the day. So in the context of learning environments, it's important to get sleep. In the context of sport, it's important to get sleep. In the context of training at work, it's important to get sleep so that we learn, and the learning happens while we sleep. All right, so that's really critical. And then overall, sleep's critical for our mood, for growth, repair, and general health and well-being. So it's really, really critical that we get what we need. And so the next question is, well, how much sleep is enough? And well, it may differ across different countries because of certain cultural, social, ideological perspectives around sleep and its importance. There's a consensus panel from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine that says for general health and well-being, as well as general health in relation to other diseases, on average, adults should look at getting between 6 and 9 hours, and on average around 7 and 8. And I think importantly, what we need to understand when it comes to sleep is that everyone's sleep need is very individual specific, and that no one person is the same. And so, yes, on average, we must get 7 or 8 hours of sleep, but we do have short sleepers and we do have long sleepers. And so don't get stressed if you're not getting the 8 hours. You may be a short sleeper. Just know what you need to get in order to be able to function the next day and not feel sleepy and not have to rely on things like caffeine and additional napping. And that's for people who are not necessarily working shifts. So on average, we need to look at adults getting about 7 to 8 hours. So importantly, if we want to understand the impact of shift work on sleep-wake behavior and therefore on a person's alertness and ability to perform at work, we need to understand how sleep is regulated. So allow me to take you through some of the basics behind circadian physiology. Effectively, we have two systems in our bodies that, and I'm oversimplifying there, the two systems that control our sleep-wake behavior. Which is asleep at night and wakefulness during the day under normal circumstances. The first is the circadian clock, right? And that is influenced by the light and dark cycle. We are typically stimulated by the light during the day, and that allows us to be awake and we are alert. And in the absence of light during dark, the body clock responds by sending signals around to different parts of our body to initiate sleep-wake behavior. But there's another system that works almost like a thermostat, a temperature regulating mechanism in a kettle, for instance, and that's the sleep homeostat. And if you think about it, if I had to explain it simply, is that the longer we are awake, the more pressure we have to sleep. And you'll find that if you've stayed awake for 24 or longer hours, is that you'll find that it's very hard to stay awake. And that's the sleep pressure system that is gradually building up. And eventually will initiate sleep without you actually realizing it, and hopefully you're not behind the wheel. So these two systems work together, and it's important we appreciate their work. The first is the circadian clock. And circadian, the term circadian means roughly 24 hours, about a day. All right. So the circadian clock produces what's called the circadian rhythm. And then we see rhythms in a whole lot of things. We see rhythms in our behavior. We see rhythms in our body temperature. We see rhythms in certain hormonal releases. And basically the circadian rhythm is a roughly 24-hour period of physiological processes that originate within us, that we, because it's controlled from within us, but are modified or affected by our interaction with the external environment. And we are most stimulated by light. And so if we're exposing ourselves to light in the morning, then our clock thinks, okay, well, let's initiate physiological responses to ensure that we are alert. If we don't have that, then it's initiating things that promote sleep. And so the biological clock is really key in ensuring that we are sleeping at the right time of the day and awake at the right time of the day. And so how it works is effectively we've got this small little system in our brains, and we receive light through our eyes, and these signals are sent via the nervous system to this little body clock. And if it's bright light, and in this case, the blue spectrum of light is some of the most stimulating for us, then the body sends signals around to all the cells around the body to say it's time to wake up, and all your physiological responses promote wakefulness. However, in the absence of light, the opposite happens, and one of those mechanisms is the release of melatonin from the pineal gland. And melatonin is a sleep-initiating hormone. that promotes the onset of sleep. And so what we see here is very simply how our circadian rhythm affects our alertness. It's a very simple schematic. On the bottom here, you've got clock time, all right? So that's 12 midnight, and this is 4 to 6 a.m. So what we've got here is that typically if you're a night shift worker, your alertness is going to be the lowest in the middle of the night, in the dead of night, between 4 and 6 a.m., not necessarily 8 a.m. And what we call this is the Circadian Nadir, and it's the most difficult part of the night to be awake in, because we are at our lowest physiologically in terms of alertness. But then we also have this other part, this other peak in our circadian rhythm, which is our acrophase, which happens in late afternoon and early evening. And this is a point where we are able to perform quite well physically, we are quite alert, and it's also quite difficult to sleep. So it's called the forbidden zone of sleep. And this will become relevant later on when we start to speak about the impact of shift work. And so the circadian clock controls this and cycles our alertness and our physiology day in and day out in a roughly 24-hour pattern. The other system that I spoke about is the sleep homeostatic process. And basically how that works out is that we've got mechanisms in our body that from the point where we wake up, and I'm referring to the graph on the left here, from the point where we wake up, the need for sleep or the pressure for sleep increases linearly. And the longer we are awake, the more sleepy we feel. And at the point where we are really sleepy and it's nighttime and our body physiologically is slowing down, we initiate sleep. The dotted line is what happened if you extended sleep and you started to become sleep deprived. So the sleep process, or the sleep homeostatic process, works as a pressure system. The longer we're awake, the harder it is to remain awake. And basically, there's a relationship between the hours of wakefulness. So the longer we are awake, the worse our alertness gets. And so this becomes relevant when we start to speak about the effects of extended shift work. And so, in short, sleep pressure accumulates as a function of time awake. There's a reduction in alertness and increase in sleepiness. And the only way to get rid of sleep pressure is through good sleep. Okay? And effectively, these two processes work together. In red, you've got the circadian rhythm. So during the day, so this is during the day, the circadian rhythm, which is in red, promotes wakefulness. But at the same time, we have the sleep pressure increasing over the course of the day. And at the point where our circadian rhythm and our body clock starts to give signals for us to go to sleep, and our sleep pressure is high, that's called opening the sleep gate, and we initiate sleep. The reduction in physiological alertness keeps us asleep. Our sleep pressure reduces while we sleep. And at the point where our pressure for sleep is reduced and our body clock starts to swing up for the start of the next day, we wake up. And that is what we call a normally entrained person. They are synchronized to day and to night, to wakefulness during the day and sleep at night. But we'll see how shift work interferes with this. Okay. So basically, we get to the focus of this particular webinar, which is now to understand how those processes are influenced or are affected negatively by certain characteristics of atypical working time arrangements, and not your conventional 9 to 5 effectively. And I think importantly, we need to first of all always consider the personal circumstances of the people with whom we are working and their lifestyle and the impact that their lifestyle might have. You've already seen from the case study that Smiles presented that some of the issues that she presented for Mr. X will present challenges to him getting adequate sleep, such as his physical health. He is suffering with ill health. That might affect his sleep. Age might become a factor for shift workers. In some instances, older shift workers can handle shifts better than younger shift workers, and that's because, one, they don't have a family, maybe because the kids have left the house, and two, because they've developed strategies to deal with that. But at the same time, some older workers can't handle shift work because their sleep-wake rhythms aren't as robust as younger shift workers. Interestingly, and I won't speak about all of these factors, circadian chronotype is also a factor that might want to be considered when looking at who should work night shifts and who should work morning shifts, for instance. Chronotype refers to whether you are a morning type person or whether you're an evening type person. Evening type people are typically better or more suited and prefer to work night shifts and late shifts because that's just, they prefer to be awake at night. whereas morning type people would prefer to wake up early and maybe work early morning shifts or day shifts. And so these are the kinds of things that you'd want to consider when looking at the personal factors. But there are many different interacting factors that make this issue quite complex, both endogenously and exogenously. So we can see some of the other factors: working time, physical workload, medications, which will become relevant in this case study. So let's have a look at Mr. X's personal circumstances, and let's unpack some of the factors that may be putting him at risk of, one, getting not enough sleep and not enough rest, which then by extension affects his ability to remain alert and respond to the demands associated with his working time arrangements. So let's look at this. So his age is 55, and as we age, there are changes in sleep architecture. Sleep becomes slightly shallower as one ages. Your circadian rhythms are not as robust, and so you tend to become more morning orientated as one becomes older, and so that may have an impact on his sleep-wake behavior. But he also has young children, and so we know from shift work studies that the presence of young children in the house will disrupt sleep if it's not managed carefully. And that might be added to by the increased domestic demands associated with having young children and school runs, etc. In addition to that, his home environment may not be conducive to good quality sleep because he's living in an informal settlement near a pub or shebeen, as Smar outlined, and there's noise. There may be safety concerns. There may be issues around crowding. I don't know necessarily about the context of his house, but those might be factors that may play an impact or have an impact on his ability to get good sleep. All right, and then obviously he's involved in community activities, which takes him away from his family and his ability to rest, maybe at night if he's on patrols at night. In addition to that, he has some chronic issues. He's obese and suffers from a variety of diseases, and one of which may be sleep disorders. And as somebody who's interested in sleep, this is one thing that's often not considered, is the presence of sleep disorders, such as sleep apnea, where people can't breathe during the course of the night, and they wake up, and so sleep becomes very shallow and non-restorative. And so we need to bear that in mind when looking at medical surveillance. He also suffers from back pain and is taking medication to do that. And there's a bidirectional relationship between pain and sleep. You can't sleep because you have pain. Because you can't sleep, you're not getting the restorative immune system function, so the pain might become worse. And so that there's this vicious cycle that might start to develop, and the medication is obviously making him drowsy. And so we have a bit of a hot mess there in terms of just Mr. X's home environment, not even before we get to talking about his working time arrangements. So let's focus now on his working time arrangements and speak a little bit about shift work and some of the important characteristics that need consideration when designing shifts and working time. So according to the International Agency for Research on Cancer, we're obviously very interested in this because there's a relationship between the development of cancer and shift work, night shift work in particular. And by that I mean association, not causation. Shift work refers to work hours that are generally outside your 7 to 6 and usually involve work that is happening at the night or early morning, and there's sleep during the day. And there's many reasons why there's the necessity for shift work and at times, and that is, that production needs to continue, manufacturing needs to continue, the variety of provision of various services, transport, entertainment, communication, working across different time zones. There are many different drivers for the need for shift work related arrangements. But there are also different characteristics and ways in which we can design the shift system. But we must always come back to that first slide that I said there's no universally acceptable optimal way of designing shifts. There are things that you can do to try and make it more human-centered. And so some of the things we need to think about is that most of the types of work that take us out of working during the day are biologically disruptive, so they disrupt our normal circadian rhythms, which I've spoken about, but they are also socially disruptive because they interfere with your ability to interact with your family, who may be awake during the day and you trying to sleep, and then vice versa. You're awake at night on shifts and the family are asleep. And so there's a biological but also social incompatibility created. And so we need to think about how do we design night work, all right, and how frequently do we have night shifts. What time do we start and end the shifts? Because that matters in terms of when rest can happen. How do we manage on-call shifts in terms of managing the risks of people being called towards the end of that on-call period and then having a really long, extended shift after that? How do we consider or manage the effects of split shifts? In other words, you work for 2 or 3 hours, you have a long break, and then you start working for 2 to 3 hours. We see this sometimes in the entertainment industry, in restaurants, sometimes in transport. It ends up being a really long day. So how do we manage the extended nature of those shifts? We have to consider whether it's continuous or discontinuous. In other words, is it 7 days a week, or do you stop 1 or 2 days a week over the weekend for downtime, for rest, or whatever? Because that would have an impact on how you arrange it. Are your shifts irregular, or are they predictable? Irregular would be some of what we've seen in the industry in aviation, is pilots will fly 2 early morning flights, so starting at 6 and ending at 3 in the afternoon. So that's 2 days of flying that. And then they'll rotate to an afternoon type shift where they'll start working at 2 and then finish at 10 or 11 at night. And while that is a form of rotation, it creates unpredictability and irregularity in the way the shift system is designed, which means that your body gets used to the early mornings and then it has to adjust to kind of some late finishes. Or is it predictable? In other words, I'm going to work 3 or 4 early morning shifts and then it's off. So you have to think about that. How long are the shifts? How do I manage overtime? Are my shifts rotating or are they fixed? And if they're rotating, what is the speed of that rotation? Is it fast, every 1 or 2 or 3 days? Is it moderate, say every 5 days to every week? Or is it slow, every 2 weeks? Or is it permanent? In other words, everyone works night shift all the time and everyone else works day shifts all the time. And then also, what is the rest? Within shifts, so break schedules, between individual shifts, and then also between strings of duty, because that matters when it comes to cumulative fatigue. So let's come back to Mr. X's scenario. Now, this is quite a busy diagram, so I'm going to break this down. But what I've done here is I've brought out some of the considerations around this individual's working time that we may want to think about. So he has a 2-hour return trip. So there's when in terms of positioning or commuting to and from work, that needs to be factored in. Something that we would need to think about in terms of how early he has to wake up to get to the shifts. We know that he starts at 6 a.m. for the early morning, and so that's quite an early start, and we need to factor that in. We know that he has night shifts. We know that he has extended shifts because he's working 12 hours. We know that he has overtime at times because of the staff shortages. We know that there are some elements of rest periods. I've thrown in that he, after 5 consecutive days of either day shifts or night shift, he has 2 days off before he rotates. But that we also know that he has 1 hour break within his shift. We also see elements of him having to deal with on-call work because of staff shortages. So he may be called to work at short notice. We've seen evidence of incomplete recovery, and we've seen some concerns around him not wanting to speak up about how he's feeling. And so maybe there's some considerations around the lack of just culture or safety culture. And so I'm going to unpack this in a little bit more detail, but I'm going to do it systematically. So let's focus firstly on the impact of night shifts. In this case, he's having to work 5 consecutive day or night shifts. I'm going to focus on the night shifts because those are the ones that are more disruptive, as you can imagine. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the effects of night shifts. And I'll refer you to the diagram at the bottom here. Okay, you've seen this. This is somebody who is typically awake during the day and asleep at night. All right, so they are awake during the day and the circadian rhythm is promoting that wakefulness. The sleep pressure is increasing and we sleep at night and everything is normal. And that is somebody who is on a normal daytime orientation. So what happens with night shifts? Let's look at this diagram here. So over here, you've got work. So they've started work. In this instance, Mr. X starts work at 6 p.m. and finishes at 6 a.m. All right, so he knocks off. He's been awake all night, okay? So sleep pressure, the blue, is really, really high, okay? His natural circadian rhythm is just continuing, so that doesn't change. And let's say that he's got his hour trip home, so he gets home around 7, he has a little bit of a bit of breakfast, and then he falls asleep, okay? That's what ends up happening after a night shift. And so what you would like to see is that he goes into this dotted line. So he has deep restorative sleep, and the sleep pressure that he's built up over the course of his night shift is reduced, and then he wakes up and he's ready for the next shift. But in actual fact, what ends up happening with night shift workers who have to sleep during the day is that their sleep becomes poor quality and becomes insufficient because they are fighting the natural inclination driven by their body to be awake during the day. They're also fighting societal's wakefulness because people are awake, most people are awake during the day. And so there's noise, there's light, there's heat. All of those make night shift work, post-night shift work sleep, poor quality and poor length. And so what ends up happening is they wake up prematurely and they've already got a heightened sleep pressure before they go into the next night shift. And so one of the main issues which we have to deal with night shift is that, firstly, night shift workers have to be awake at the wrong time of day according to their physiology. All right, they're awake at a time of day where they are naturally have a reduced alertness, there's increased sleepiness, and that will affect performance at night. They also are associated with being awake for extended periods of time, and that's because night shift workers, unless you know how to manipulate your sleep, don't typically nap in the afternoon before they start their night shift. And so maybe they've been awake for an extended period of time before they get into the night shift. And therefore, you know, as we said with the sleep homeostatic process, you start to see decrements in alertness and increasing sleepiness. And because they've been awake for an extended period of time, by the end of the shift, they are at increased risk of accidents on the way home if they are driving themselves home. And we've seen this in some of the medical cases where doctors have been awake for in excess of 36 hours and then driven home and unfortunately crashed on the way home. There's also circadian disruption because you are fighting your body clock and saying, be awake at night and sleep during the day. That's not what we're designed to do. And so sleep is typically reduced by 2 to 4 hours if we try to sleep during the day as compared to sleeping at night. And unfortunately, transitioning into the first night shift is always the worst, because we're coming off a string of sleeping at night and being awake during the day. And so we have to think carefully about how we transition. And that's where strategic napping becomes important. The next and important things we need to think about in terms of night shifts is what happens when we work consecutive night shifts. So we already have discussed the fact that there's 2 to 4 hour decrement in sleep on average in some instances if you're attempting to sleep during the day after a night shift as opposed to sleeping at night. And so what that leads to is what we call cumulative sleep loss. And I'll show you in the coming slides in that the more sleep loss we experience, the greater the impact it has on our cognitive performance. So we incur what's called sleep debt. And in the coming slides, I'll explain this in a little bit more detail. And so we struggle to deal with getting enough sleep because of activities at home and domestic responsibilities, societal disturbances, and maybe in some instances, moonlighting. And that's a reality for many in our country who will work one job, go home, maybe have a little bit of rest and go to another job. And so there's no opportunities for rest. And obviously, in this case, Mr. X's health will present a challenge to him and may affect his sleep. And so what I spoke about in the previous slide is that over the course of a series of night shifts, you start to see the accumulation of sleep debt. So if I'm an 8-hour sleeper and I'm only getting 5 hours of sleep, I accumulate 3 hours of sleep debt per day. In the case of Mr. X, let's say that he's also an 8-hour sleeper. He's only getting 5 hours after his night shift because he's trying to sleep during the day, because he's got a commute, because of his health status, because of the effects of his working environment, of his home environment. He's going to incur sleep debt, which is the difference between what he gets compared to what he needs. And so he incurs the sleep debt, and that has an impact on cognitive alertness and performance. And we've seen this in some of the studies that have been done in laboratories. In this particular environment, I'll just orientate you here. This is a study that was done in 2003, but it's been replicated many, many times. What they did is they brought participants into a laboratory and they kept them in the laboratory for 14 days, okay? And there were 4 different conditions. People or participants could sleep for 8 hours each night. Participants could sleep for 6 hours each night. participants could sleep for 4 hours each night, or they were totally sleep deprived. In other words, they weren't allowed to sleep for 2 days. And then they looked at, over the course of this 14 days, the impact of this cumulative sleep loss. And so let's have a look at what happened. With 8 hours sleep, you can see that performance over and they looked at attentional lapses. So the higher the higher the lapses, the worse performance has gotten. And what they found is that over 8 hours, you can see that performance doesn't really change too much. Okay, so that's on average. 8 hours doesn't change. 2 hours less per day results in quite a dramatic increase in lapses over time. 4 hours has an even more dramatic effect. All right, and so this is where we start to see the impact of cumulative sleep loss associated with night shift. And so this is a risk associated with working consecutive night shifts. And look at what happens when you're completely sleep deprived for 2 days. It just goes completely out the window. And so what we see is that sleep loss, cumulative sleep loss, is really a challenge associated with night shift work and something we need to be mindful of in how we manage it. Another issue with Mr. X's shift arrangements is his 12-hour shift arrangement and the fact that at times he's got to work overtime. And so extended shifts in and of themselves present a risk. More, if we add the effects of night shifts, then we start to see the complexity of the issue. And so let's think a little bit about extended periods of duty. Extended periods of duty are preferential for workers. Workers like working extended duties because it means that they can work fewer days per week. They can work a compressed work week. Say they're working their 4 12-hour shifts. In the case of Mr. X, it's 5 hours. They're getting 48 hours of work in 4 days. And then hopefully, if the system is designed well, there's more time off. That's in an ideal situation. Organizations like extended shifts because they can employ fewer staff to get the work done. So instead of having three shifts of 8 hours, where you've got to employ 3 different groups of people, you now just have 2 shifts, so it's just 2 sets of people, and that's great. So it's easy to arrange, it's convenient, there's fewer staff, and it ultimately, hopefully, will save you money. All right. But the challenge is that extended shifts are associated with extended wakefulness, and we know from some of the earlier slides that that's associated with reduced alertness and increased sleepiness. There's also the issue of increased time on task, and we know that Mr. X's task is very cognitively demanding and he's sedentary, and so that can add workload, to the experience and can result in cognitive fatigue and vigilance decrements and disengagement from the task. And so that's where we have to consider the nature of the task when designing extended work shifts. We have to limit exposure. We have to make sure that there's no excessive cognitive or physical overload, and that there isn't any sort of safety critical issues going on. And if there are, we need to manage that. Are people being overloaded, or are they becoming bored? But we also need to consider the time of day. And we know that Mr. X in this case works evening and night shifts. And so you've got the effects of night shift, which I've already spoken about, combined with extended shifts. And that's where we start to see the interaction between different types of working arrangements. And I think the effect of this is no more apparent than some of the seminal work done in the early 90s, where researchers made a comparison between hours of wakefulness and the effect that it had on cognitive performance and the effects of blood alcohol concentration on cognitive performance. And what we can see here is that the longer one is awake, the worse performance gets. So the decrement here is performance. But what you notice when you look at the blood alcohol concentration is that the higher our blood alcohol concentration, the worse our performance. And the slopes of these graphs are the same. And so really, the effects of alcohol and extended wakefulness on performance are similar. And so why would we want to put people in scenarios where they would behave in a comparably destructive way as being under the influence of alcohol? So we need to be mindful of that in how we manage it. This is a laboratory example, but it's important to stress the point. Let's continue with our analysis of Mr. X's scenario. Because he lives an hour away from work, he's got to wake up probably quite early. And because the morning shift or day shift starts at 6 a.m., he's got an early start. Okay. Let's say, for argument's sake, he's got an hour to leave to get to work. So he has to leave home by 5, which perhaps means he needs to wake up by 4 a.m. to get himself ready and either get to public transport or get himself there. What are the risks associated with early shift start times? Well, the first is that because we know we have an early morning shift the next morning, we try to compensate by going to bed earlier. But if you remember from some of the earlier slides, the way that our circadian rhythm works is that it's difficult to advance your bedtime. It's difficult to go to bed earlier. Like if you are usually going to bed at 10 or 11, it's difficult to start to go to bed at 8 or 9 because your body is not used to it, and you may still be experiencing this zone of forbidden sleep. And so workers may attempt to sleep early, but it's not possible. And so you lie in bed and you ruminate and you get stressed because you worry that you're going to not get enough sleep. And then you've got the added challenge of the anxiety of missing your clock. And that affects, and we know this experience, that affects the quality of sleep and the ability to stay asleep because you are ruminating. And there's a degree of anxiety behind that. And so what you have in this instance is maybe premature rising, and that leads to inadequate sleep length and quality. Obviously, in this case, Mr. X has to commute. And so depending on how long they have to commute, they may have to wake up really, really early. And so that also takes away sleep. And so again, we arrive at a situation where early morning shift start times can and are associated with starting to accumulate sleep debt. Maybe not as much as night shifts, but it all depends on what time of day that early morning shift begins. And that's really, really key. So in this instance, the early shift start time may influence the quality and quantity of sleep that Mr. X gets. Let's move on to the next scenario, which is the rest periods that he's been given, both between shifts and between strings of duties, but then also within each of his shifts. Okay, so we know that he's been given 2 days off between each cycle. We know that he gets 12 hours between each shift, and we know that he gets 1 hour of break every 5 hours. Let's start with breaks during work shifts. All right, so we know that he's working for 5 hours. He has a break for 1 hour, is working for 5 hours. Okay, and that takes us to roughly 11 hours, and maybe there's a bit of work on either side. Okay, when looking at breaks, you need not only consider the length of the break, but you also need to consider the characteristics of that break. All right, so if the work is taxing, then we need to think about, well, how can we ensure that the break, because that's what it's meant to be, is a restorative experience. So the characteristics of the break is, where is it happening? How long is it? What is happening during that? And what is the frequency of that break? In this instance, I would argue that Mr. X's break is not a break, because he is not being afforded the opportunity to remove himself from that working environment, remove himself from the engagement of that task, remove himself from the environment in which he's working. And so there may not be any change associated with how he's feeling. And this is why we need to consider the characteristics of that break and start to think about change in environment. So break should, there should be added stimulation from moving around, from physical activity, which we've seen is alerting. It has an alerting effect. Or that it's recovery through relaxation, through socializing with colleagues, or through strategic napping, which is important for instances where they work night shifts. We've seen this in aviation, in air traffic control as well. And so what I would argue here, the risk is that there's going to be vigilance decrements, drops in attention, drops in alertness, which may affect his performance, particularly if it's cognitively demanding. Let's consider the breaks between work shifts. Now, often in the design of breaks between work shifts, the commute is not obviously or often factored in. The need for personal time, that's biological needs, showering, going to the toilet, spending time with family, domestic responsibilities, but also this wind down time, the ability to, you've gotten home from work, you need to kind of wind down before you initiate sleep, and then consider how can we protect an 8-hour sleep opportunity. And in this instance, Mr. X is getting 12 hours, but we know that he's got 2 hours taken away from his commuting, so that takes it to 10 hours. That leaves 2 hours for him to spend time with his family, to wind down, and then also to sleep. And so what we're seeing is probably a little bit of a challenge there, and it's difficult to manage in this instance because of where he lives. But the minimum should be at least 11 to 12 hours between shifts, but it depends on the characteristics. If shifts are disruptive to sleep-wake behavior, then maybe the break between shifts should be longer, if it is operationally feasible to do so. And then lastly, let's think about the breaks between strings of shifts. In this case, Mr. X is likely not going to have enough time off, particularly after night shifts if he's only got two days. So let's say he works Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. He finishes his last night shift on Saturday morning. And on Monday morning, he has to start day shift. That effectively gives him just Saturday night or Saturday day and night to kind of recover from a whole string of night shifts. And then Sunday to kind of get some degree of interaction with his family going, and then one more sleep before he has to get into the day shift. And so that's probably not going to be restorative enough. And so we need to think about the characteristics of the duty. Normal day shifts, some would argue that 2 days off and 2 full nights of sleep, of uninterrupted sleep, may be enough. But if shifts are disruptive to sleep-wake behavior and contain things like night, early mornings, extended work, you may want to look at slightly longer breaks, 3 or 4 days, to ensure that people have adequate rest. So that's something that needs consideration. Let's look at the impact of the on-call environment, and that he may have to be on call because of the fact that there are impacts on short work shortages for staff. But we need to think about how on-call affects an ability for someone to recover. So if you know that you are on call, right, you are always anticipating the call. The anticipation of the call can lead to physiological stress. And if you are trying to sleep, physiological stress, or stress in and of itself on its own, will reduce the ability to go to sleep and increase sleep latency. In other words, you'll struggle to go to sleep. You'll spend a long time in bed before you sleep. It may affect the ability to stay asleep, and it may affect the ability to return to sleep if you've been awoken. And so ultimately, it reduces sleep quality and sleep quantity. And so if you do get that call after this scenario has happened, you're going to enter into your work environment where you would have not had enough rest. And so on-call can create unpredictability, it can create anxiety, reduce sleep and general recovery, perceptions of needing to catch up. But if it's not managed correctly and someone is called at the end of their on-call period, so they're on call for 8 hours, they're called at 7 hours and 45 minutes into their on-call period for a 12-hour shift, that's going to mean that they're going to be awake for nearly 19 hours. And we know that that's associated with reductions in alertness and performance ability, which will present safety concerns. We come to the last part of this, and that is he often comes to work feeling tired. So we're seeing the impact of his home and his working environment on his ability and his tiredness. And importantly, he doesn't want to say anything to his supervisor because he feels he's going to get punished. So there's evidence of a lack of just culture, reporting culture here. And so importantly, we must look at the human here and the system. Now, often maybe a supervisor would create an environment where they would blame the human for being fatigued. I've heard people sit around the table and say, you are fatigued because you play too much golf and you don't go to sleep early enough. And all that does is it nullifies the complexity of the situation, and you blame the human for not getting enough rest. But we have to bear in mind that fatigue results from a human's interaction with the tasks, the environment, the technology, the humans, and the working time that they have. It is that creates fatigue. It is the design of the system that creates the fatigue. And if the design of that system creates fatigue, which is an inevitability, it will subsequently affect the way in which that individual interacts. And that is what compromises safety, is that the system is badly designed and person get fatigued and it's not managed properly. That's what can lead to the error, the incidents, and the accidents. That's what we need to think about. And so W. Edwards Deming always argues that a bad system will beat a good person every time. And so we need to look at the system and its design, but also we need to look at the culture around reporting and honesty and being honest about fitness for duty, particularly if we are having challenges at home. and we're working shifts that are disruptive to sleep-wake behavior. And so here, colleagues, we have a complex interaction of his home environment and his working environment that creates a little bit of a hot mess and makes, I'd imagine, a manager's life quite challenging. And maybe this is quite overly dramatic, but maybe for some it's a reality. And we need to appreciate these complex interactions. The last part that I'd like to speak about is the fact that while these kinds of shifts would affect our ability to perform while on shift, in a career of shift work, there are risks associated with negative health outcomes. But as Marino et al. Argue in the latest position statements from the Working Time Society, I would definitely recommend you go and have a look at those. There's about 10 or 12 consensus statements by the Working Time Society, which are, I think, downloadable from the website. They argue that while non-standard working times are clearly associated with increased risk of negative health outcomes, the physiological mechanisms underlying or mediating these are poorly understood. Okay, but there is associations between working shifts, disruptive shifts like night shifts, early mornings, things that disrupt your circadian rhythm, and diseases such as gastrointestinal problems, cardiovascular health issues. There is an association between night shift work and cancer, but it's not that simple in that it's a complex interaction of many factors. Circadian misalignment, melatonin suppression because you're working at night, so your melatonin is not functioning properly, internal desynchronization, so you're trying to sleep at a time of day when you should be awake and vice versa, chronic sleep restrictions, so you're not getting that immune system response and that recovery. People might start to develop sleep disorders, which we've seen with Mr. X. There's also disturbed socio-temporal and behavioral patterns. So in other words, shift work affects your interaction with your family and your partner, so it creates lifestyle stress. And it might affect the way in which you cope with that. So shift workers are increased risk of abusing alcohol, maybe some prescription drugs to try and get to sleep. And all of that creates scenarios for the manifestation of disease. So it's quite complex, but there is the association, which is affected by a person's age, gender, genetics, disease state, etc. And so we need to be mindful of that, and that's why medical surveillance of personnel working these disruptive shifts is critical in order to try and create some degree of balance. And so we come back to the first point I made, is that we need to see the design of working time as an ecosystem, and that we can't isolate our focus on each and every one of these things, because the reality is it's a hot mess and it looks a little bit like that depending on how it's arranged. But it's also influenced by personal factors, task factors, technology factors, the environment in which you work, and other organizational factors such as the culture around safety, as well as the context of the work. And I think this is something that we need to be very mindful of when we start to speak about the impacts of COVID on how businesses are trying to remain productive and not retrenching, but it's creating a whole lot of stress in that system. And so that's it from me for this particular part. Sma, back to you.
Yo, Jono, thank you so much. I think you really managed to take a really, really complex, phenomenon with so many, like, multifactorial phenomenon, and try to condense it in such a short space of time. I wish we had more time, but I think you really have managed to show our audience just how complex this is. And I think if we go back to the common approaches, I think they can probably already start to see, I hope anyway, where some of the gaps are in the way that their organizations are currently designing and managing work schedules and shifts and the like. So I know we have about 30 minutes left in the webinar. I see there's still quite a lot of people online, so thank you for staying on. A couple of people have dropped off because of load shedding and other work commitments. So please just note, I've seen there's a couple of people that have been asking if we're going to be sharing the recording. We definitely will share the recording so that you can catch up if you missed some of the parts because of load shedding or other reasons. And before I get to anything else, before we get to the questions, and just to wrap up maybe and to plug into where Jono ended, we said we would come back and talk about some of the practical implications now, or the practical considerations for managing ergonomic risks when designing and managing shifts and roster schedules. And I think the idea behind this is to say, we know what where we're coming from when it comes to industries and work scheduling and shifts. We know where we currently are, especially how much more difficult it has become because of COVID and other, economic pressures that organizations are experiencing and that workers themselves are exposed to. And now, especially now with the case study that Dr. Davy has gone through with us, we now understand just what are all of the different factors that need to be considered as we are designing and managing work schedules and shifts and the like. And so this last slide that I'm going to take you through is to say, so now in practice, what does this mean for some of the, processes that organizations currently have? Where do you need to go back and start looking at possibly, updating how you're currently doing things? And this is just going to take a couple of examples of places that you can already go back to and try to understand where the gaps are and where you could improve. And the first one, I think, go back to your organization's hazard identification.
With us.
Look at your occupation. Yes, I'm here.
Sorry, I lost you there.
I'm here, Jono?
No, sorry.
Oh,
sorry,
okay, okay. All right. Sorry about that. So the idea is that you're going to go back and look at your hazard identification processes, your risk assessments, your occupational risk exposure profiles, post-incident and accident risk. Go back and see if you're currently able and currently actually unearthing all of the relevant risk factors around your work schedules, your rosters, and the shift work that you're currently doing. And based on experience, and I've reviewed so many risk assessments, normally this is not currently being done in a lot of organizations. And so what that means is that even from your risk assessments and the controls that you derive from the risks that you have identified, there's already a big gap. And so what you would need to be done is that you need to go back, review those, and see where you are missing some of the factors, update your risk assessments so that they are a true reflection of the exposure within your work environments, and then adjust your controls so that you are actually effectively and comprehensively addressing all of the risks across your entire system. And so that would need for you to also go back and look that you are not only focusing on what people are doing at the shop end, but you're looking at across your entire system and understanding how is your organization managing these things. And this will require that you even go back and you look at your policies and procedures, and you go back and you understand how is your organization, what is the stance in terms of managing shifts and roster schedules? What is the stance in terms of, provision of rest breaks and all of that? And if your policies and procedures are only looking at, are we complying or not, you are clearly missing the point. You are clearly having a lot of other risk factors that you're probably not managing, but they are affecting your operations, they are affecting your people, and they are contributing to compromised safety and of your operations and of the people. You also then can go back and look at other processes, organizational processes. So, for example, during recruitment, are you even going to, looking for possible risks that people are bringing into the organization? So do you screen and check if people already have sleep disorders? Because as John already indicated, that those people are more susceptible to some of the effects that he was discussing? Are you doing medicals that can screen if people are already experiencing some of these occupational risk exposures, maybe from before they even come into your organization, so that you understand how you can better manage that? And if you need to make additional adjustments to the work schedule, make them to some level. I know in the audience, one of the participants already indicated that they themselves are suffering from a sleep disorder, and that becomes an issue with these standard shifts that she has to be working. And so it's really important that you understand who is coming into your organization. But also when people are leaving, because you would have hopefully been doing your medical surveillance and extracting or screening for some of these health effects associated with the shift work and the rosters that people are working, you will know if your organization is actually contributing to them developing some of these disorders from the time that they come in periodically and when they leave. That's one of the requirements that are required. If you look at the ergonomics regulations, for example, even in there, it specifies that medical surveillance in terms of exposure to ergonomic risks is something that would need to be done. And what we've been doing today in terms of the ergonomic risk factors that have been discussed, that would be relevant even for that. It then also goes back to looking at tasks and jobs and how those are designed. Because if your design of tasks and jobs is not optimal, you are already asking people to do more than they would need to ordinarily. You are already contributing to an increase in workload and complexity, which will then also potentially, catalyze the process of people becoming fatigued sooner. And so look at how you can or rather look at the tasks and the jobs that you already have and see how you can optimize those for the users so that you can minimize the workload and the other exposure risks that we have spoken about. And then this one, and I think this one for me is one of the areas where I think organizations are bringing in a lot of risks without even realizing it. So in the BCEA, it makes provision that variations can be made in terms of the minimum and maximum limits that are provided for work scheduling. And one of those is that through agreements with labor, workers, and the organization, you can vary. For example, you can agree that people can have 10 hours rest between shifts. You can take away some time in terms of rest. You can agree to reduce, or rather to postpone rest so that people can work, consolidate work in a week and then only rest next week, the following week. And based on the risk factors that Jonathan was already talking about, I think you can already see that those kinds of practices, which are signed on and agreed by workers and management or organizations, you are already bringing in all these risks. You're not even bringing, and in a lot of cases, you're not even bringing in, the experts who can come in and say, where are the risks? Help us understand how these decisions are going to affect workload, how they're going to affect fatigue, how the rosters that come from that are actually probably also bringing in other risk factors. So please, I know that there's some negotiations happening with some of the unions currently in terms of these variation agreements. I know in particular in the rail space, these discussions are happening now. Make sure that you are asking these questions and you are risk assessing your decisions before you sign this for the next 3 years or 5 years or however long it is. Also, organizations also will have overtime incentives where workers have suddenly become so dependent on this overtime pay. And this sometimes comes at the detriment of the efforts to manage some of the risks such as fatigue and workload and so on. So even there, the organization's decisions regarding how overtime is managed, and of course workers will agree to some of these suboptimal settings because they want the money. I think even there, just as organizations, as labor, work together to ensure that you understand the risks that come with this. And it becomes very difficult to take that kind of arrangement away from workers who have now become dependent on this overtime pay. Also, you might find that suddenly people are having to take unplanned shifts when someone doesn't report for work or at short notice. So even when you make those decisions about who are you going to call, who's going to come and close in on this shift, make sure that even when you make those decisions on the spot, you are considering the risks, that you understand if this person was at home, they're not necessarily on standby, but are they actually fit to come to work, given the fact that they're supposed to be resting because of the exposure when they were at work for maybe for the previous week. So make those decisions knowing what the risks are, and then put in the control measures to ensure that those risks do not end up negatively affecting the workers and operations. And so even with planned standby shifts, I've seen this trend in a lot of organizations where they will come in and they say, we have maybe 3 shifts, and the one that is working maybe during the day also becomes the standby shift later. And they say that that's acceptable because standby requirements hardly ever happen. But the fact is, just because the person isn't called out, they are actually on standby, which means that they actually that's part of work. So effectively, what I've seen is that some organizations, because of this arrangement, will essentially have people on duty for 24 hours. And yes, just because the on-call doesn't happen, the call doesn't happen, doesn't mean that this person is going to be able to, work as they would normally do, sleep as they would normally do. And so you need to understand the implications of that if you're going to have that kind of arrangement. And so even when you are also planning workload, planning how you're going to allocate tasks, planning how you're going to arrange work, understand that the way that you design your shifts will have implications for the workload that is experienced by people. And therefore, even that becomes a consideration, because it might be a risk if you don't manage it adequately. And so even for fatigue risk management related systems, you need to put those in place, and they need to be responsive, sufficiently responsive to any changes that are happening to shifts and rosters and the like. Go back also and look at your occurrences. Understand if there are any risks which are brought in and contribute to occurrences or accidents and incidents that could be linked to your shifts and your roster schedules. Because if people are, for example, falling asleep at certain times during night shift, then of course, the way that is designed is that it's going to make them fall asleep. It's going to make them start making more errors because they're working during suboptimal times. So go back and look at your occurrences, look at injury statistics, and see when they are happening, and if some of the schedules that you are making them work are actually contributing to this. And then another area, people who are involved in auditing. Auditing is such a big thing in organizations. And normally this is, and I say here blindly, deliberately I say blindly, because it's normally driven by compliance. Are people working 12 hours? Are you complying to the variation agreement? Are you giving them, breaks as prescribed in legal requirements? And so because it's blindly compliance driven, some cases you find that the risks are actually not being brought up during the audit process. And I mean, the whole idea behind auditing is to check if everything is working as it should be, to check, yes, if compliance is there, but to check also if the risks are being managed in the way that they are supposed to. And so I think this is an opportunity to use the audit process to make it work for your organization by bringing to the fore some of the risks associated with some of these shifts and rosters. And I think Jonah also touched on the safety culture. Even during your audits, check if safety culture is an issue that is possibly contributing to some of the risks that risk factors that he was discussing, but also ensure that you are not putting processes in place that reinforce negative safety culture elements that will prevent people from telling the organization if there are issues that they're experiencing linked to the work shifts that they are working and the schedules and so on. But I think ultimately, the idea here is that we need to start taking a more systems-based risk management approach when we are managing ergonomic risks associated with work shifts and roster schedules. And I think this is a good time to go to Jonathan. Let me stop sharing, and maybe to kickstart the discussion. I would like to maybe give Jonathan an opportunity to maybe, based on literature, can you maybe give us an idea of, are there any frameworks that are currently out there that have been proposed for managing some of these issues? I know you've prepared a slide for us because we've preempted this question, and in fact, it came up in the chats as well. But I think this is a good time to maybe discuss that maybe for the next 5 minutes while I look at some of the other questions that we have there. Over to you, Jono.
Thanks, Ma. I will share my screen shortly. In short, yes, there are, and it really, as you've argued, the key is to think about this from a systemic perspective, and not look at it in isolation. So I'm just going to make sure that I can share this properly. We've discussed this. Yeah, so I mean, really what it comes down to is that one needs to consider how to create some degree of balance, balancing both the negative and the positive sides of work, to ensure that humans are safe and that work is productive. And one way we do this is through the systemic approach. What we've got on the side here is a model by Jens Rasmussen, who is a very large proponent of safety. And his argument that in order for risk to be managed effectively, there needs to be vertical integration between different levels of stakeholders. So those who are doing the work at the sharp end need to feed back to those who are making decisions on how the work is designed, and those who are making decisions on how work is regulated, so that the design of working time, the design of policy, etc., reflects what actually happens at the coalface, and vice versa. And so there needs to be consideration of this vertical integration. And the model that we've created here is, we call it a nested hierarchy of systems, starting from the micros, so humans and workers doing the actual work, to meso, which is looking at teams and organizations, and then to macro, which looks at organizations and their interaction with the broader context, government and regulators. And so there is a framework that we can use, and the ways in which we can approach this are multi-layered, and that's probably one of the best ways to try and manage some of these challenges, not just those related to fatigue and shift work, but broader challenges. So the first relates to creating education, awareness raising, appropriate coping strategies, and medical screening of all individuals across the organization, to ensure that they understand the effects of these kinds of things, but also that you can monitor that, as you've spoken about, Smo. The other is then to use evidence-based, contextually relevant and balanced rostering practices, and also ensuring that home work-life boundaries are respected. I know that's not shift work at the moment, but we're seeing with people working from home a lot, this blurring of these boundaries between home and work, and there's this lack of respect and ability to disengage from work because you're working from home. So we need to think about that in the current context of COVID. You also need to be mindful of the fact that you can ask your workers about how they experience the shifts, and look at participatory fatigue risk identification and management, and also start to create this culture of reporting, learning, and support. And that should happen across all levels of the organization. And then, Smo, coming back to one of your first points, is that there needs to be appropriate up-to-date legislation on working time that can and does reflect not just how long someone works for, because historically that was how we managed physical work. But as work has become more cognitive, you need to think about, and happening at all different times of the day, you need to think about how our ability to work changes across the day and night, and changes depending on how long we've worked for, the nature of our work. And so some of the strategies we could think about in terms of managing fatigue and managing the effects of working time is looking at trying to create programs around effective sleep hygiene and fatigue management training, fatigue proofing. So how can you use strategies like caffeine, bright light exposure, physical activity, those sorts of things as ways to fatigue proofing, they call it. And then also looking at monitoring health disorders, and not just for workers, but also for management and also for families, so that the families understand the importance of good sleep hygiene, respecting the shift worker's ability or need to sleep, if that's possible. Maybe in the case of Mr. X, it wasn't. We also need to think about using or not using working times as targets. We all want to get the most out of our employees, but getting the most out of them doesn't mean squeezing them for all they're worth. It's about designing that system so that they can feel productive, safe, and work at an appropriate time. And so trying to reduce as much as possible work that's done at night, trying to reduce the number of shifts that they work, particularly if they're disruptive, trying to increase predictability. Because if shifts are unpredictable and they rapidly change all the time, you can't develop some kind of regularity around your sleep-wake behavior. Getting good sleep is about regular sleep-wake behavior. And so there is a little bit of a challenge there, because some would say, and one of the questions was, should you rotate your shifts really quickly, like every 2 to 3 days, so night shifts, then afternoon shifts, then morning shifts, or should you do it much more slowly? Some would say limit the number of disruptive shifts, so go really fast. Some would say, no, do it slightly more slowly so that people can get used to that. I think in this instance, it really comes down to what works for you as a business, as an operation, and what is conducive for the workers, and what do they prefer from a lifestyle perspective, while acknowledging the risks associated with that and managing it. Trying to maximize rest opportunities and considering the things that happen around rest, trying to limit or manage on-calls very carefully, and trying to limit extended work hours as much as is reasonably possible to avoid decrements in alertness and stuff. And then also in terms of working from home, not necessarily as a shift worker, respect the right not to be disturbed and develop policies around respecting home work-life boundaries. We've seen that very effectively in other countries where work emails and phone calls stop after a certain time and are only started at a certain time the next day. You need to look at starting developing fatigue mismanagement programs or fatigue management systems as part of a broader safety management system, where there is the culture around reporting, learning, monitoring, adaptation that Smi's spoken about. And there's many things that can feed into that, that can allow for evidence-based decision-making on what's appropriate for what's happening within the organization. And then ultimately, we need to, at a very high level, consider the interplay between the latest science and operational experience to design appropriate working time. In aviation, this is very, very relevant, and the International Civil Aviation Authority or organization argues that there needs to be the marriage between the latest science and operational experience to design working time for that context. There shouldn't be any reason why we shouldn't do that for other contexts. So maybe when you come to variation agreements, this is where the science and operational experience need to marry. And so this is the nested system of hierarchies, and I would argue that if you can get some of this right, you may be on your way to trying to manage some of the effects of working time and other emergent risks more effectively. So Sma, back to you.
Thank you, John. I think that was a really nice overview, to end this webinar off on, because we haven't just given the audience this is what the problems are, but just a snapshot of what you could start doing to try and address them. And I think there's a question here, I like how you ended off and spoke about the fact that we need to marry the science, the experience. And I think it reinforces what we've been trying to say here, to say, don't only focus on complying to the law, understand what this is. And they're going to experience, the shifts, the risks very differently. And because of that, you cannot design for each person, to tailor for each person. And I think that point that you made about the fact that we need to understand the science and we need to understand the experience, because if you get feedback from the workers, if you go and you do your risk assessments based on your operations, if you go and you do surveys to understand the impact of some of these risks, you can then use that information to understand where are the biggest issues. And therefore, instead of just complying to the law, you try to design for your organization's risks and what your people are experiencing. So I hope that answers that question, Max. And I think there was another question. I see we tried to answer some of them when we were not presenting, but we're going to take maybe another 2 or 3 because we've got about 6 minutes left. There was a question from Duncan: if the workplace is not sufficiently lit, will it increase the fatigue of workers? And the answer is yes. Poorly lit environments usually are one of the risk factors in terms of fatigue development, especially if it's a task that's visually demanding. So yes, that could be a contributor to fatigue. And then Figiso says, is this data-based? What credible evidence can one acquire to further drive and convince bosses of the need to relook shift patterns, more precisely night shifts? And do we have something to refer to, or is the presentation more about caution? Oh yeah, there's definitely literature. And I think if you go back to Jonathan's presentation and even some of the stuff that I presented, that's all based on studies that have been done. And so you can use that to reinforce your argument. But I think the best thing is always to go back and understand what's happening within your organization. So do the assessments, do the surveys, speak to your people, look at your production and the changes there, look at the quality of your output and see where some of these changes could be coming, and then try to see if there's a link to that. I don't know if you want to add to that, Jonathan, while I look for the next question.
No, I think you've summarized that nicely, Smile. I think it really does come down to data. When you're trying to manage any fatigue-related risks, it really does come down to data and getting all that information that you nicely summarized in the interim presentation together and using that evidence to motivate for change. Yeah, but I'm learning the importance of understanding the workers' views and experiences of that. That is key. The softer side of it, not just the hard evidence.
For sure. And there were a couple of other questions where people were asking, giving us scenarios, I guess, from their working environments. And unfortunately, we can't go through all of them because of time. But I think if you follow the principles that have been presented to try and understand if there are any issues or what the risks are, that will set this point. There's a comment, I think, from Dion, where he's saying that with reference regulations, it's making sense to him now why the ergonomics regulations are saying it has to be a competent person that does these risk assessments. And I cannot agree even more with you, Dion. This is exactly why we need, because I mean, I've seen risk assessments that have been done by someone who's not necessarily well versed on the subject, and what then happens is that they'll miss a lot of the complexity, the emergent risks. And so definitely, Dion, I think Jono and I agree with you on that. Make sure a competent person does the risk assessments related to this. And of course, you can find someone who's competent in one aspect of ergonomics and not necessarily on the other. So always make sure that you go back and understand where their competence and experience is. And then there was another question. Okay, Jade, no, yours is specific to your scenario, but maybe we can have a chat a bit later. And then there were, I think, 2 questions asking about are there questionnaires and can we give them a template? And the answer is, yeah, we can't, I think, because it depends on what you're trying to assess, because whatever is going to be the best tool for that will depend on what you're trying to assess. So maybe that one we can't answer at this point. But I think because of time, it's 2 minutes before 12:30. I'm just going to try and maybe ask Jono if you have any last words to say so that we can close up.
No, Smile, just to say thank you for the opportunity to share this. I think as you say, the management of working time is a really interesting but complex issue. And I think the question that was about, are there things that you can ask your employees? There are a variety, and I'm very happy to provide some context specific examples. So you're welcome to contact me. I don't know if my email, I can put my email address in the chat there. Everyone's welcome to contact me with specific questions, because there are certain questionnaires or surveys that you can use in order to get this information, but it all depends on the context. But yeah, I think the key is really just to look at this as an ecosystem and not look at it in isolation, because all of these different things interact, and I guess that's what makes it complex but fun and interesting to look at.
Yeah. I think from my side, I would definitely reiterate what you've just said, Jono. The thing is that we are hoping through these sessions that you can learn something that you can go back into your work environment and start applying it, start asking questions about how you're currently doing things and where the gaps are and how you can hopefully start improving them. And yes, you are more than welcome to contact either Jonathan or myself. And I think our details, will share them also when I send the recording next week. And the idea is that, yes, we don't necessarily have all the answers right now, but some of them require a little bit more context, specific information to be able to then give you a proper answer. But from my side, I think as we close off, I would like to once again thank Dr. Davy. I'm not used to calling you Doctor.
Jonathan's fine.
I'd like to thank Jonathan. I'd like to thank Jono for agreeing to be a part of this webinar. I really, really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise with our audience. And I think, based on the response, I mean, we had over 700 people registering for this. This is really, really a really pertinent issue. And when you're filling out the evaluation form as participants, please, can you tell us if there are any follow-ons that you would like us to do, any sessions or specific topics that you would like to find out more about, and we will see what we can do maybe to organize that as Smart Ergonomics. But besides that, I think please remember, yes, we will share the recording. If you are a SIOSH member and you would like to claim your CPD points, please note that it is CPD verified for 1 point. So if you need any confirmation of attendance, do contact me. My details will be, I think they're already provided in the communication about the webinar. And then besides that, if you have any other ergonomics risk management services, training, whatever the case is that you need from Smart Ergonomics, you're more than welcome to get in touch with us, and we will see how we can assist you. But from my side, and I think from Jonathan's side, thank you very much for attending, and enjoy your day further. Goodbye. Salanigash.
Thank you.